Okay.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. We are here tonight with Dr. Vanessa Ruiz, and I want to welcome you. I mean, Vanessa and I have been working together, gosh, for how many years now? We've collaborated on a variety of different functional nutrition and food as medicine courses for healthcare practitioners, and she is just phenomenal, so talented in this case of trauma and how do we help heal our bodies holistically and naturally from that. So it's just a no-brainer to ask her to come and talk to our group. She has nationally spoken on the effect of adverse childhood experiences, the toll that trauma takes, and how do we raise resiliency. So I think that's one of the things that she's going to impart upon us tonight is that the hope is that there's always the opportunity to heal and to improve. And how do we do that? But first we have to understand, what is trauma? How does that affect the body and our aging and our metabolism and our longevity? And then what do we do to heal? So with that, I'd love to welcome you, Dr. Vanessa Ruiz, and look forward to hearing from you. And Shay, I know you are at work and kind of on another computer viewing this, so thank you for showing up. If you have questions, you can always put it in the chat, or if you can unmute and you want to ask a question, we want to keep this informal. So any questions during the conversation, Dr. Vanessa Ruiz has agreed to keep it interpersonal, and we can talk as well as at the end. So with that, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here. And I was just telling Cindy that this is one of my passions, primarily because I do find that a lot of people don't realize how certain events in their life impact them and can lead to them maybe constricting and feeling like they're not fully expressed to be themselves. And so that's what these events can do for us. But my hope is that we can, expand beyond that and find ways to, despite the trauma that's happened, be our full and authentic expression of self. And so there are ways and tools to be able to do that, to be more resilient. And so I hope that I can impart that today. Okay, so let's talk about the toll of trauma, the hidden impact on aging, metabolism, and longevity. And, I'm going to be talking at it from a few perspectives. One is I am a mental health practitioner. And so there's going to be some clinical terms. There's going to be some diagnostic criteria just to help just to help you understand what we look for when it comes to trauma. And I'm also then kind of going to flip it over and make it kind of more relatable. I got into this work because really I had complex PTSD, and it's one of those things where I think once I hit consciousness and I started to develop who I was, I just kind of thought I was innately broken and that there was something wrong with me. And what I didn't realize, and I began to realize that as I got older and I was in safe, supportive environments, that I just wasn't given as a child really an opportunity to develop and learn in the ways that I needed to. And that there wasn't really anything wrong with me. It was just I wasn't really given an opportunity in a safe environment to fully develop and grow my physiology, my mental capacity, and also my emotional capacity. And so I hope that my story kind of, for those people that kind of feel it sometimes like, oh my gosh, I'm just this broken person, that's actually not the case. And that given a safe environment, you'll have the opportunity to flourish and to blossom into who you are. So the goal of the talk today is to talk about chronic toxic stress, how that affects aging, our metabolism, and how that affects our longevity. We're also going to talk about quote unquote trauma and the impact that it has on our physiological responses. And we're going to talk about the vagus nerve because that's kind of one of those really core foundations in developing nervous system regulation and also being able to be present in the moment, and to regulate our physiological processes. So that's really all done by the vagus nerve. It's a fascinating and complex nerve. We're also going to learn about ways to be resilient during times of stress, because it's not like we can ever fully avoid stress. We just want to make sure that we're not moving into distress, because good stress, called eustress, actually changes us for the better. It helps us to grow. It helps us to reach our potential. So not all stress is bad. We just have to make sure that we don't physiologically move into distress. And then I'm going to invite you to compassionately reflect on maybe how some of the impactful events in your life may have caused you to constrict, to become less of your authentic full self, and see how you might be able to gain more support for yourself, and also maybe see how you can use some of these things to be more resilient. So what exactly is trauma? So trauma is an event. It's the impactful events that, in red I put here, that overwhelm our coping skills and our response, overwhelm our coping responses and skills. And I really want to highlight that point, because a lot of the times when people think about trauma, there can be a little bit of a minimizing effect, in a sense of, well, even though that event was impactful for me, I didn't go to war. I didn't see anyone die. I didn't die. And so we kind of minimize how that event may have changed us. And so it's not about the gravity or the tragedy of the event. What we really want to look at is, how did it overwhelm our coping skills? And how did it change, right, the way that we had functioned? Hello. And how did that change how we functioned? And I'll give you some examples of this, because I think it helps us to really kind of be more compassionate about what trauma is and how it can imprint in people. So for example, one traumatic event, right? Remember, we're not thinking about the actual event. We're thinking about the ability of that person to cope, right? Think about an infant, right? They don't really have a lot of coping skills. In fact, their coping mechanism is really their parents. But imagine sometimes there's situations where they may be removed from their caregiver, and that secure attachment breaks down, right? It leaves that infant releasing more cortisol, and even a stressor like the temperature in the room, right? That could impact that infant. And so the infant might not realize it, but later on in their life, they develop separation anxiety, right? It's not something that they can remember, but their body might remember that, right? So again, infant with very little coping skills experiences an impactful event and it changes them, right? Another one, child being bullied in school, right? A lot of the times, I mean, we might have experienced bullying and we might minimize it, but then our experience is that maybe when we're around strangers, we're less likely to be ourselves. We become quote unquote shy, right? And sometimes that child may not have the coping skills to emote or express what's going on, but every day that they're in school, they feel like an outsider. And so every single time they feel this lack of belonging, they get a release of cortisol, which unfortunately in infants and children, releases of cortisol aren't really tolerated well by their growing bodies. And sometimes it may even halt certain organ systems to not fully mature, or it might even accelerate maturation. For example, children who have a lot of adverse childhood experiences, those being around neglect, abuse, um, the girls might actually have younger menstruation. So instead of maybe having menstruation at 13, 14, they might be having it at 9 or 10, because the body's accelerating aging, right? And also it's accelerating in the sense of, well, it's not safe for me to have a childhood, and I need to move into adulthood as quickly as I can, right? But this one, an adult being in a car accident when they were, where they felt like they would die or be hurt, that triggers a stress hormone release, and maybe their baseline has changed. where they were driving before and now they're no longer driving, right? So that changes the function in their life. So there are different kinds of trauma, and these are some of the things that I'll share with you. They're kind of coming at it from more diagnostic criteria. There's something we call adjustment syndrome, which is essentially an impactful event occurs, and it renders that person past their coping skill, and they're having difficulty adjusting, functioning day to day. And it might look like they start to avoid certain situations. And typically, avoidance is marked by kind of a trigger. But I want to be mindful here too with the use of avoidance, because oftentimes I find that the word is kind of stigmatizing. You're not trying to avoid something like it's the tax, like you're trying to avoid taxes or you're trying to avoid laundry. It's really what it is that in these situations, there's a tremendous level of vulnerability that you feel, and that there's a tremendous maybe overwhelm of physiological responses that you might not be able to mitigate by yourself, right? So it's not avoidance that you're conscious of, it's the I physiologically and emotionally feel a strong vulnerability in this situation, and I'm choosing, or I'm not going to put myself in that situation. So in some senses, I do reframe it for my clients that it's more of like it's a powerful way of keeping yourself safe. So it's not avoidance, right? But the diagnostic criteria phrases it that way. There's agitation, there's hyperarousal. And really, hyperarousal means that I am cued into all the senses around me, and I'm looking for safe threat. I'm looking for something that could go wrong, right? And so this is all happening temporarily. After several weeks, this person will likely return back to a new functional norm, right? So this is kind of a temporary form of PTSD. So an example of this is I had a client who they ended up having a medical biopsy. It ended up being threatening for her, like she was in a lot of pain, but also it didn't go the way that she thought of, and she had trouble sleeping after that. Then after several weeks, after doing some counseling with her, she began to sleep better again. Okay, so that's just a form of, it's called adjustment syndrome. The next one is that we're all pretty familiar with is PTSD, where you experience an impactful event or events, right? But it's clearly delineated. Like you're able to say, okay, from this point, I experienced a change in my physiology, in my mental state, my emotional state. Okay. And that I've had trouble functioning since this event occurred. So it's quite clear for people most of the time. And it can present with flashbacks, like you visualize something, or it can present as nightmares, trouble sleeping. There might be difficulty in certain situations that could be triggering. There's hyperarousal again, and then there's also withdrawal, meaning that you were maybe doing certain things and then you stopped doing them because you felt unsafe. And then you don't come back to your functional norm. And that's really what we want to look at is the functionality. Like what changed after this event occurred for you? So here's one other one. I had a client who experienced medical trauma. She called 911, and unfortunately, they weren't able to come to her at an expedient time. And now she has trouble being alone for more than 15 minutes. And if she is alone, she ends up developing panic attacks. So that's like after that event, it's very discreet, right? You know, when that event occurred, then I developed this. With complex PTSD, which is actually a fairly new diagnosis. It came out just several years ago with ICD-11, and essentially it's the chronic exposure to impactful events where there's development that's affected, there's ongoing changes to the physiology, and it's often related to something like relational trauma or secure attachment. And when I think of this, I think mostly of, say, domestic violence, unfortunately, child abuse, where it really impacts the person's sense of self, and it also impacts their sense of relating to other people. And there's a tremendous level, because it is long term, there's a tremendous level of chronic toxic stress that ends up happening. And it basically, it has the same uh, symptoms as PTSD, but you're adding on relationship issues and poor relating to self. Okay, so some of the examples I gave you. So really, when we think about children who have been exposed to abusive home environments, their brains really, their little bodies, they don't really have a chance to fully grow and mature. And so a lot of the times they may be still using coping skills from childhood that kept them safe. And that's totally okay, right? Because until they develop more or learn more coping skills, as long as it's kept them safe, those things are biologically appropriate and also functional for them. Okay, so we're not, I'm not, you know, a lot of these things are compassionate based, and so is a lot of healing with this too. The other thing I do want to mention is that because in complex PTSD, there's a lot of endocrine imbalances at such a young age, there also ends up being a lot of gastrointestinal issues, a lot of cardiovascular issues. This is, kind of if the person, the young person at 25 that ends up having hypertension or diabetes at, say, age 18, 19, because really they've had metabolic disruptions and dysregulations 10 years prior to that. And now you're just seeing it as they get older. And they're also very likely to have chronic pain. Okay, so we have such a tremendous ability to be able to survive stress. And really, I'm going to invite you to kind of use this metaphor as a Ferrari, because really the different responses that our body initiates at the time of stress, it's probably the most advanced technology. So I'm going to compare your bodies to a Ferrari. Okay. And so really what ends up happening, what ends up happening is that you have stress, right? And essentially that's like the revving of the engine of the Ferrari, right? It's meant to create that short burst of mobilization so that you can survive. And literally what's happening when the Ferrari revs its engine, right? Your combustion processes go up. So basically your metabolism has to go up because you're using so much energy, right, to rev that engine. And this is why also metabolism is going to be kind of going hand in hand with your stress responses. And that's why oftentimes when you see somebody who's experienced chronic toxic stress, they have metabolic issues because all this time their body had been trying to keep them safe and in survival mode. Okay, and so maybe it's not about necessarily taking the antihypertensive. It might be having to help the nervous system and the metabolism get better regulated. And we'll talk about that later. Okay, so some of the normal responses, right, is blood sugar is supposed to go up when you're under stress. Your blood pressure is supposed to go up when you're under stress. And unfortunately, your ability to think with logic and reasoning goes down, and your default patterns of thinking actually go up, right? Because those default patterns, right? You've survived all this time. They must have worked, right? We're not looking for creative solutions here. We're looking for something that historically kept you safe. So if you're engaging with somebody like in a conversation that might be difficult, sometimes it's harder to think of a creative response, right? You think of the response like an hour later because now your body's better regulated and your logic and reasoning side of the brain is actually, you're able to connect to that. Whereas under stress and under cortisol, you're only able to really access emotional states. Okay. So that's why people are like, oh, I'm under stress and I can't really think. Actually, there's a literal hormonal wall that prevents you from accessing your logic and reasoning brain. Okay. So under acute stress, you're revving that engine, right? And the Ferrari is basically burning through its stores and it's in a hypermetabolic state, right? That's great because now you're safe, right? But for many times, right, you every Ferrari needs to go back to the pit. It needs to go into recovery. It needs to get the tires changed. It needs to fill up, right? It needs to get the oil changed because it can't be at such a high performing state for a very long period of time. And that's really what acute stress is. That's our stress is meant to mobilize us for short periods of time. And then in theory, we're supposed to go into recovery. But for somebody who's experienced trauma, well, hey, like it's very unlikely, right? Unless someone is teaching them and guiding them to move into recovery, right? And that's why it's so actually important to start to look into ways to keep yourself resilient, start to look at ways to help you manage your stress, because those things are our pit stops. They help us to change the tires, refill, right, our oil, and change our gas. Okay, because otherwise, when we keep driving our Ferrari, revving the engine, maybe unintentionally for a really long time, we actually move into inflammaging. It's that combination of inflammation and aging. And we're like, suddenly, things are a little bit more painful. I do my regular walks, I do my regular exercise, but you know what? I'm not get it. It's taking me a longer time to recover. And that's what it can look like if we're not incorporating those things or making those pit stops. Okay. So let's go more in depth because again, trauma is an event, right? What it does though is that it can create an imprint on us that then renders us, if we're not moving into recovery or resiliency, it can have these lifelong effects. So trauma is that kind of overwhelming stress on us. And some of the metabolic responses that can happen is our digestion will stall. You can have the most beautiful salad, but if you're under fight or flight, you're not going to be able to absorb and digest it properly because cortisol in the presence of, the migrating motor complex, which kind of helps your gut to move, gets stalled by cortisol. Okay. The other thing is you end up having high blood sugar, and you could have a meal that actually is pretty balanced, but if you're under stress, you're breaking down your muscle mass and protein, you're less receptive to insulin, and you're also breaking down your fat stores, so you have as much gas as you need at that time, right? And then when you're in recovery, then your blood sugar can go back down. Okay. There's muscle breakdown because even though the body doesn't really want to use protein, it's going to, because if it needs all that gas if you're trying to get your Ferrari revved. And then there's also inflammation. And think of it this way, right? We always talk about inflammation being a bad thing. But actually, you need homeostatic inflammation. You need healthy levels of inflammation because inflammation is going to help your gut lining. It's going to help you restore your joints, your bones, keep them strong and maintaining them. But what ends up happening with inflammation for long periods of time is it becomes too high because we actually don't have that opportunity to restore or change our tires, right? And so that we have this constant inflammatory process going on because we didn't get to change our tires. And actually, those tires are probably more likely to break now. Okay. Other responses, right? You've got the trauma that happens, but then what happens with your brain? And this is actually really interesting because unfortunately, it's for those who experience PTSD, it's quite uncomfortable. But from a biologically appropriate standpoint, it's gearing them up to be survivors. First one is neurodegeneration of certain areas of the brain that aren't prioritized for survival. The creative parts of your brain, they're less like the creative, logic, reasoning parts of the brain. They actually diminish in brain volume. The reason why is you're probably not going to use that for survival, whereas the amygdala, which is involved in fear conditioning, fear learning, and fear memory, that's more heightened, right? Because it's not like we had Google back then or paper or notes where we can just, memorize where there might be danger, right? We had to essentially kind of have an emotional response to something, and that created memory for us. The more emotional something is, the more it stays in our brain. Like think of the happiest times of your life, right? And think of the saddest times of your life, right? You can pretty much call that up to memory at any point. Whereas think of the meh times in your life, right? Or like, what did you have for Sunday breakfast? I don't know, right? Because it's not important for your survival, or the other thing is for your connection. Because that's the other thing I want to mention is the biological priorities are first your survival. The second one is your connection and belonging to society. Okay, because that ends up kind of being important for survival. Okay, the other thing is now your brain is primed to learn fear conditioning and fear learning. The other thing is looped thinking. So like, you know, you're so tremendously focused on the thing that is dangerous. You just keep thinking about it all the time. Keep thinking about the urgent stuff, and you can't think about anything else. Right? That's part of the response of those impactful events. And then neuroinflammation. Okay, other things, emotional responses. And this is actually where I find that a lot of people start to kind of judge themselves based off of their biologically appropriate emotional responses. Because a lot of our emotions are actually driven by hormones. When we see somebody who's familiar and we get that warm feeling in our heart, that's the vagal system being activated, and that's also oxytocin, right? The moment that you experience cortisol, it's going to essentially create that feeling of edginess and irritability. It's going to have you kind of look around for things that are maybe potentially creating doom and gloom for you. And it is biologically appropriate in times of survival to be angry and aggressive, right? Because the angry and aggressive person, they're likely going to be able to initiate their fight or flight response, get mobilized, and also kind of be in defensive mode, okay? And then hopeless and depressed. This is actually a really common one that I see. Once the chronic toxic stress, it's really, really impacted them for a really long period of time because they can't rev their Ferrari anymore. In fact, the Ferrari is pretty much, there's no gas, it's literally tanked. And so when someone has hit this phase, they essentially move into a physiologic depression, which sometimes people can interpret as, I'm a depressed person, when really it's you don't have the ability to mobilize yourself during even day-to-day stress. Because one of the most stressful times in our day that is a natural stressor, waking up. It actually engages our metabolism, our brain, everything has to turn on. And so that's actually the time where you need the most cortisol, but your gas is tanked. You can't mobilize a stress response to the slightest stressor in your life, whether it's I need to get up in the morning or I need to write that email. Everything just ubiquitously becomes stressful. And so again, it's not you, it is your physiology that is at play here. Okay. And most people with PTSD, CPTSD, they have blood sugar issues. Again, your stress response, your stressors, intimately tied with metabolism. Inflammation and aging, trouble concentrating, lots of nervous system inflammation, trouble with relaxing and being in constant fight or flight, digestive troubles, because I told you how it impacted your motility, not enough brain oxygenation, low vagal tone, and I'll talk about the vagus nerve because it's such a beautiful nerve and does so many different functions for us that we don't even realize. Low cortisol and hormonal issues. So how do we fix this, right? This is a really complex problem, and it is definitely not going to get fixed overnight. But one of the first things is really learning to reduce inflammation, because that's big, right? Safety cues, internal and external. How do we, in this person that has experienced this impactful event, how do we help them to feel safe? How do we help them to gain control over maybe the internal flashbacks? Like I have a client that I'm working with, she unfortunately has childhood developed CPTSD, and she's only now learning how to feel safe in her body. And so sometimes it looks like, I need you to take your blanket and I need you to just rub your blanket. How does that feel? And how does it feel like to feel your body on the seat, right? Because that's one of the first grounding things is I need to be able to feel my body first. Okay. Utilization of assets. This basically means that each one of you who has experienced an impactful event somehow survived it. If we can use your survival traits, characteristics, right, and really see them as assets. So for example, I had a client who unfortunately saw her daughter move into anaphylactic shock, mobilized herself after, the daughter had an allergy to peanuts. And unfortunately, fortunately, depending on how you looked at it, she developed OCD. So now she's all constantly searching for exposures. And we actually had to reframe that, where at first she was like, I don't want to live like this anymore. And I was like, I completely get it. And, right, I know you don't want to live like this anymore. And somehow this helped your daughter to survive. And so if we can look at that as a tool, if we can look at it as a way that it's actually a strength that you have, right? We don't want it to be the only thing, right? But how can we develop other things as well, in addition to using this as an asset, right? Sometimes you also need to do integration, which is basically things like EMDR, accelerated resolution technique. These are specific techniques that are done by counselors and therapists to help somebody integrate that into their nervous system and memory. And then we also have to look at how the impactful event caused you to grow, right? What are some of the things that, if this event hadn't occurred, and we don't wish it on anyone, don't wish that it happened, but how did it make you who you are today? So also looking at that too, because that's important. You're not just what happened. Right? The other thing is community and support. Super important, because we'll learn in future slides how important community is, how our nervous system is actually wired towards social engagement. And then a metabolically supportive diet is blood sugar is going to be one of those first things that get changed. Okay. All right. So we're still a Ferrari, right? We've still got our engine revved, right? Hopefully we've done our pit stops when we needed to. And so now let's take apart that Ferrari. And what we see is the engine of the car, right? Our nervous system is like the different settings. And from a simplistic point of view, it's like the different gears, right? You can go really fast or you can go really slow. And that's really what our nervous system is like. And this theory, I think you guys actually had done, or you've done a session on the vagus nerve. There are different gears to our nervous system. And for the most part, our vagus nerve has been developed basically to engage and to connect with other people. And the basis of the polyvagal theory is, even though we use it largely a lot in trauma, it's actually based off pediatrics, where the more bonding that the mother and the infant does, the better survival there is for that infant. And so that's really the basis of social connection and belonging. It's because we as infants and children, we will survive better if this mechanism is in place. Okay. All right. But it also is how we also regulate our nervous system. Okay. So at the very top, you see safety and social engagement. Okay. Our nervous system is meant to connect to other people. It is meant, and it can feel safe with other people. Okay. And that's why relational trauma is just the worst, because it really impacts that safety aspect of our nervous system. Okay, so that's done by a specific part of our nervous system called the ventral vagal. Okay, safety, social engagement, being present, being in flow state, you know that part of your vagus nerve is being activated. Okay, the second one is mixed vagal and sympathetic. It's called fawning and appeasement, and essentially, it's basically like, I don't know if I have a dog, but if anyone has a child, like, let's say you're going out the door and the child is like grabbing your leg. That's basically their mixed vagal / sympathetic system is being engaged, right? Because in that moment, they're like, oh my gosh, you're going to be leaving me, right? So the sympathetic system is kind of bringing up that mobilizing factor. The child is a little bit stressed, right? But because you have a safe attachment, it's also requiring that vagal nerve state, right? Another way that you can see this from an adult perspective is, let's just say you get pulled over by a police officer, and you're like so incredibly polite. You're like, yes, sir. How are you doing, sir? Like, I'm so sorry. That's that fawning state, right? Because you don't want anything negative to happen in a social context, right? So that's kind of that state. The other one is fight or flight, which, a lot of people who've experienced trauma, they kind of hang out in sympathetic a lot of the time. In fact, it's very well wired in the brain. Okay. And then shutdown is dorsal vagal. And this is typically when you see that somebody who is physiologically depressed, they spend a lot of time in vagal mode. Okay. And so this is where they're not really able to handle the stressors. The other thing, because all these different states, right, we think about them as purely being human, they're actually evolved with other animals too. Like the example of shutdown mode for other animals is, if you've ever seen like a fainting goat, that's pure dorsal vagal. They get scared and then they just kind of fall to the side. The other one also is deer in headlights. You get the shock, and then there's like no ability to necessarily mount a stressor response. Okay, so these different parts, right? These different gears of our nervous system, we're constantly switching back and forth through them. We just don't even realize it, right? So the more that I'm characterizing it for you, I'm hoping that you can kind of see how it's relating to your day-to-day life. Okay, because the truth is that your vagus nerve, it's really wired for, again, that connection, that belonging. And that's really where we thrive, and that's where we survive best. And so when we're feeling safe, these other states that we think of under stress, they actually provide a lot of benefit for us. So for example, our sympathetic state that we usually use for fight or flight, it is used for play. So think about it, right? When we're playing, right, we're laughing, we're like hyper aroused, right? We're kind of like, when is that basketball coming to me? We're so focused, right? But we're not internally anxious, right? So that's really what fight or flight is meant for. It's that play response. When we are safe in a secure relationship, that fawning, that part of the mixed vagal, that's really meant for connection, for intimacy, right? Like, honey, when you ask your partner, like, honey, what do you want for dinner? And inside you're like, I really want pizza. And she says, oh, I would really love like mac and cheese, right? You're like, yes, honey, I thought the same thing. That's pure fawning response. Right? Because it helps to build that connection and intimacy, right? The other thing is, what about shutdown mode, right? Like when we think about the fainting goat or we think about deer in headlights, right? What is it meant for when we're feeling safe? It's actually meditative states. It's being able to sit down and, I'm in Colorado right now, being able to see like the snow and just watch it, right? Watch that snow fall down. That's that meditative state. You're using that dorsal vagal state when you're feeling safe. Okay. So safety is feeling safe, being in safe connections, so important for our nervous system, and it's actually really healing. Okay, so here's the thing, right? A lot of us who've had impactful events, right? What do we try to do? I'm just going to try to forget about it, right? But the thing is that sometimes, and especially if you do have PTSD, it's an issue with memory archiving, right? Because what ends up happening is that most of the time, memories, right, they're supposed to kind of become integrated and get fused in and blended through a coherent timeline, right? That's why when I asked, did you guys remember what happened for breakfast, right? It was this blended thing that happened, right? There was nothing, maybe it was a great breakfast, right? There's nothing that you could necessarily remember in particular. But with a traumatic memory that overwhelms your coping skills, you aren't able to integrate that into a cohesive timeline. So basically, the brain just kind of compartmentalizes it, right? And so there's no access to new information, doesn't get integrated, right? Your childhood memory, right, of an impactful event, it's usually well retained in the sense of like it's not integrated into who you are now. It almost seems like it's just this closet in the back of your mind where you can't seem to access your internal resources now. Okay. And so think of it as kind of just being this compartmentalized thing. Okay. They're called closed loops. Okay. So maybe as you're talking, you're starting to say, okay, hey, like, I'm remembering this impactful event and I'm realizing that there are some I'm experiencing some trauma responses. Then, what do I do? Right. And so I just want you to know that the trauma response, the other side of that is just your resiliency. Those are actually the two sides of the same coin, right? Because if you didn't have that initial response, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have mobilized yourself or brought yourself to where you're at now. And so there's already kind of an expectation that you are resilient purely by the fact that you survived and you're here and you're doing your thing day to day and you're doing the best you can. Right? So it's kind of an assumed resiliency purely by the fact that you're here. Okay? So a lot of the times, when we experience an impactful event, right? What we might try to do is, and there's nothing wrong with this, right? I do it for sure. I know my clients do it. But what it ends up doing is kind of taking a little bit of us and our authentic expression or our ability to be more creative, right? So most of the times when we experience that impactful event, our initial reaction might be, I'm never going to do that again, or I'm never going to expose myself to that again. And that's helpful in the immediate moment, right? But what if it keeps going on, right? So if you only focus on preventing the trauma occurrence instead of learning resiliency and being able to regulate responses, this is what it kind of looks like. So these are actually real client experiences. So relational trauma, like if you experience a relational trauma and you stop being in intimate relationships, right? You lose that opportunity of being connected, having that secure attachment, right? Or a client exposed to a dog attack. They just decided that they weren't really going to go out of their house anymore, right? So that functionality is gone, but the opportunity for them to be living the full capacity of their life, right, is compromised. Client experiences trauma at the airport and no longer flies, right? And if you only fly maybe once every 10 years, that's not a big deal. But if your family's going for their grandma's 65th, birthday, right? You kind of get to miss out. But remember, these are all normal responses, but there is a loss of function. Okay. So that's one way to be able to cope with trauma, right? Is an impactful event happened and I can just decrease my functioning, right? The other way is to focus on the resiliency that we have and focusing on how do we normalize these responses, right? So that we can retain our function. We can retain our ability to live our life the way that we want to without necessarily avoiding or withdrawing. Okay, so what that could look like, right? So if someone experienced relational trauma and intimate relationships create a feeling of unsafety for them, then that the skills that they would need to acquire is feeling safe first in their body, and then being able to assess for relationships that are healing, right? Going into another destructive relationship might not be the thing, right? That might be more traumatizing, but maybe learning the skills on what is a red flag? What is a green flag for a person? What's a neutral or yellow flag for me to know so they don't enter into these relationships? Okay. The client who's exposed to a dog attack, they experience these flashbacks, these responses when being around dogs, and they end up doing EMDR so that they can actually get out of their house. And then when they see a dog, they breathe through that. And, right, they do a little bit of avoidance. I'm gonna try to avoid the dog, right? I don't need to be in their face. I can be a safe 30 feet away, right? That's a mixture of avoidance and also using resiliency. The client who experiences trauma at the airport, they continue to fly. However, they try to travel with other people as often and take, they might take like a Benadryl when they fly. And so those are ways that we can focus on regulating our responses, focusing on our resiliency versus of completely avoiding the potential for dysregulation. Okay, so what can I do today to help me be resilient, right? Um, there are a lot of things that we can do. And thankfully, you can just pick and choose which ones could be something that you're gravitating towards too. The first one is building secure attachments with people and having a sense of belonging. Incredibly important, because really what it's doing is it's helping to enhance that ventral vagal part of your nervous system and helping your nervous system to get regulated. So that's probably one of the most important things you can do. Nervous system regulation and safety building. So this is something that you would do internally. Like when you're feeling, maybe you're feeling tension, a migraine headache, you're just breathing through that. You're trying to relax your body. Those would be forms of nervous system regulation. Omega-3 fish oils. So there's a lot of research actually on how omega-3 fish oils, or excuse me, omega-3s and fish oils essentially kind of create this resiliency in your brain. Okay. And conversely to that, right, is avoiding omega-6s because they actually can trigger more neuroinflammation. Protein and good blood sugar control. When your blood sugar is low, you actually become less resilient. The way that I can maybe paint this for you, it's outside of physiology, is when you have high elite performance athletes and they hit this quote unquote wall, it's essentially because their blood sugar has tanked. And so it's not like they exhausted their willpower. It's they literally can't push forward because blood sugar is low. Okay. And so, if you're feeling like, oh, I just don't have any willpower and you've hit your wall, whatever that looks like, it might be good to nourish yourself with nutrition. Adaptogens, so these are herbs that you can find, say, in the grocery store. Lion's mane would be one of them, maca, ashwagandha. They essentially help to balance out cortisol levels so that your cortisol doesn't spike too high. And then also if it is high, it can help to keep it in a more regulated state. Meditation and mindfulness. This is incredibly helpful because it can reduce your threshold. It helps you also move into that place where you're hitting dorsal vagal, right? And so you're spending more time in that vagus nerve and relaxed state, and you're starting to tone that vagus nerve. Okay. Other things, probiotics, prebiotics. incredible amount of research that states that there are certain actual bacteria strains. So when you experience an impactful event, and then you'll actually see a shift in the microbiome or the bacteria or the flora in your gut. And when there are actual flashbacks, nightmares, and the onset of the trauma responses, you'll see a certain spread of bacteria. And so, and you can actually, once you mitigate these bacteria, you can actually see a decline in those PTSD symptoms. So a lot of good research saying that prebiotics, probiotics can help you to be resilient from day-to-day stressors. And anti-inflammatories, turmeric, ginger, just the foods that you're selecting, chrononutrition and chronotherapeutics, essentially making sure that you're kind of honoring the circadian rhythms, sleeping when you need to, making sure that your blood sugar is better regulated, or consuming more complex carbohydrates in the morning versus at night. Those are some of the things that you can do today that can help you really be resilient to past stressors, current, and potentially future. Okay, I think that is the end.
That was robust. That was so full. I was taking tons of notes. So thank you for doing that. Really helped understand. And I want to open it up for questions. So anybody who has questions, but I was just curious, like with nightmares, because I've heard clients talk about that. So it is oftentimes nightmares a reflection of past stress and trauma?
Yeah. So a couple of things could be happening. One, there might be dysregulation in blood sugar. And so their blood sugar dips down, cortisol comes up, and unfortunately, um, we we end up kind of having an emotional imprint to hormones. And so cortisol can often present as a certain type of pattern that's familiar to that person. So that's why the blood sugar regulation can be helpful, because then they're not spiking the cortisol, and then they're not moving into this state of stress. Yeah. And there are also some really interesting somatic techniques that we can do. There's also EMDR, especially if they're the nightmares and flashbacks tend to be recurrent, like there's the same theme over and over again. There you can actually do EMDR to start to integrate that.
Can you explain what EMDR is? Because I'm
Thank you
thinking
for
that a
asking.
lot of people might not know what that is.
Yeah, so EMDR is eye movement reprocessing. So it's basically your eyes move back and forth, helps to access both sides of the brain, and helps to essentially integrate those memories.
And is that something somebody could do on their own, or do you always work with somebody who's trained in that, who's guiding you?
Ideally somebody who's trained in guiding you, because um, it's often it's often dysregulating to go back to that traumatic memory.
Hmm.
And so when there is just when you go back to a traumatic memory, and then you hit an emotional state, you can get re-traumatization. So ideally, it should be with somebody who is trained to be able to, one, teach you the foundations of, okay, I'm not feeling safe. What can I do now to help myself feel safe? That really needs to be the foundation of it. Um, so, and then when they actually have mastered that, and they're actually resilient, they might not actually even need to go back to the memory. So that's also a possibility. But then there's also the EMDR, there's accelerated resolution technique, or art therapy. It's not the drawing art, although the drawing art could also be helpful.
Other questions sorry, I don't mean to take everybody's time, but anybody else that's on the call, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, because this is the time to take advantage of Vanessa's wonderful expertise and knowledge in this area.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when you were talking about like trauma events, what would make somebody react differently to like the same event? Or I think about sometimes just certain situations like my sister, something that happened in our childhood. It really affects her differently than I feel like it does me. And why would that be, I guess?
I don't know your sister, but oftentimes I see that people may have different vulnerabilities. And so they might be looking at the event through the lens of that vulnerability. And like, for example, if someone's afraid to be alone, and while the event may have been neutral, they might not have been resilient in that moment, and it triggered their vulnerability. Does that make sense?
Hmm? Yeah.
And so it depends on one, what their initial resiliency level was and what their vulnerability is. And that's actually, in being able to define that, that might actually be a gateway to creating safety around for that person. So they feel vulnerable when they're alone, right? Then that could be something to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Did that
Yeah.
answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Well, I just really feel the connection between body, mind, and through all this. So, and I recently I just had a procedure today, so I felt I mean, and they happen. It's like life, and I know, there's traumas that are large, and then other ones speak to I'll tell you, my particular thing is I notice every time I go to the doctor, I can guarantee I'm going to have a high reading for blood pressure, and it's like it's like, and I'm try to control it and make something else happen, and um and it's just it feels like I can feel an emotional block and don't quite know what to do with it. And I hear I'm not alone. That a lot of people that happens.
Yeah.
That But also, I've been doing work on it because I was getting ready for this procedure, and one of the things I heard to do was to welcome it to the feeling that I had to a certain extent and not try to run from it, block it. And I heard you saying that in when with the mother of the child that had the peanut allergy and going overboard, but you can, going overboard with your obsessiveness, but it can also be seen as a strength if you don't, and I feel like there's something about that in my situation too, that there's things about it that I never thought of. It's, well, that's part of, I feel like for me, it might be something about I'm afraid to be, I'm going to be tested. Am I going to fail? Because you're always, when I go to the doctor, that's how I look at it. They're going to test me and they're looking for something wrong. And um, but what I'm hearing from you is that it's not impossible, and things can take time to work out, and some traumas you need help with and get it. And other
Yes.
ones we can maybe do some work on our own, maybe, or with a group, or just feeling, for instance, today I went and I had a whole group with me, when a group that I belong to, and they were all sending me, texting, you know,
Yes.
sending juju kind of thing. And it was a big deal, and anyway. So, and the procedure ended up being not, it was, I gave it, I made it the most difficult it could be. I think it was as close to a spa experience as I've had. When you know what I mean? It's like they do everything
Yeah.
carefully, and I was just, it was all very nicely done and everything, but I couldn't sleep at all last night. And, so
Yeah.
I gave it to myself. But yeah, anyway. So I think what I'm trying to say is I really appreciate all this. It's kind of like an opening up of understanding that that well, I wrote down specifically that that play is another response to fight or flight. I mean, if
Yeah,
I'm fighting and
other of
fighting,
it.
then maybe I could make it a party, or play a little game with it. I don't know, or
Yeah,
the one was connection and intimacy is fawning instead of clinging and trying to nice your way through because you just don't trust your own Ferrari self, shall we say?
yeah,
You know, and am I getting them? Am I on the right track there? Are they positive aspects of shutting down? I can look at that as a positive way to think of shutting down is opportunity to meditate and
yeah. Let
and
me take a step back.
okay.
Take a step back. Let me integrate. Because right now I need, there's too much going on.
Yes.
That's, yes.
Overwhelm.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And here's what a lot of the times we do hard things and we never really celebrate ourselves for it.
It's okay to do hard things sometimes,
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
failing because it's hard. It's just, it makes me more resilient. I think one of the problems might be that it exacerbates it is I try to avoid it. I try to avoid going to the doctor. I try to avoid and just that having those hard experiences sometimes is what builds my resilience maybe. And
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that what could change also your future
yeah,
in terms of doctor visits, because I suspect you probably won't stop going, right? You're not going to totally,
yeah,
right? That would be total loss of function. But to create for you right now, uh, a celebration of a hard thing that you've just done so that you can actually identify and know yourself as being resilient. Because you didn't, a lot of the times we do a hard thing, we don't celebrate it, and then we're like, oh gosh, I'm not strong enough. I'm not a strong person. But meanwhile, we're consistently doing hard things, but just not taking mental inventory of it. And so just like really take this moment to be like, wow, I got through that. That was so hard for me, and I got through that, and I can do it.
yes, I hear you.
That's resiliency.
Yeah, you just don't feel strong when you're doing it. You feel like you're
Oh, wow.
in and taking the next step and doing what you got to do and whatever. But
Yeah. Yeah, there are and really truly like we don't want to be white knuckling our entire life, but there are some things that we might normatively have to white knuckle. Like I don't think I could, having my going to the dentist and have a tooth cleaning, right? I think that that's maybe going to be a form of dysregulation for me during, right? And that can be okay too. It doesn't mean that I'm weak or it doesn't mean that I'm not strong enough. It just means, ugh, this is a hard, icky situation.
you're saying white knuckling is a skill. It's a skill.
It can be. It can be. Yeah, it can be sometimes. We don't want to do it all the time, right?
Oh, no, but if it's a skill, then it's not an enemy. Oh, I'm white knuckling. I'm at the bottom of the barrel or whatever. It's like I'm using white knuckling here. And
It's a tool, yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
did have a feeling today that because I had the connection, you were talking about the connection when I went in with others, and this guy for one, but a big one, but also having other people, is texting me and lighting a candle for me and everything that I thought you know you could kind of you could play with this, instead of yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
is the word you used, if
Yeah.
instead of fight or flight, and very creative. Thank you. One other thing, you mentioned blood sugar. Where
Yes.
does high blood pressure fit into that? Is that you never mentioned that, but it's also a stress.
Oh, absolutely. The purpose of high blood pressure is to get nutrients, oxygen in particular, as fast as possible and as quick, as strong as possible to all the areas of your body, in particular your legs, your and your arms, right?
Mhm.
Because those are the ones that are going to be running and you're going to be fighting, right? So that's that's why you're getting high blood pressure at that moment. That's why, but right, we don't want you to constantly be in high blood pressure, right? We want to enter into recovery so that your heart doesn't get so taxed.
Mhm.
And find a way to not feel like I have to run or, use those parts, right? I mean, to say, is it?
Yeah. And looking for ways to be able to go into recovery, right? You need your pit stops.
Yes.
And you also need, during some times where it might be stressful, ways to be able to, okay, this is intense.
Yeah.
Let me just take a breath. Let me just call a girlfriend, right? Calling a lifeline is also an asset.
Thank you very much. This is
Yeah, no problem. It's a pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. I mean, this was so helpful and useful and pertinent to life. This is something that we deal with at so many different levels and things that sometimes we suppress and we don't remember or we don't think about the impact that it had on us or how it has on us. And even like what Shay said, how it impacts people differently. And it really is coming in with different skills, different resiliencies. And so we have that opportunity to build that resiliency, to grow stronger. We always do. It doesn't matter how old we are. And I love that. I love that there's always an opportunity. So thank you so much for everybody coming and joining us live. And I'm gonna follow up with the link on our membership chat. And then also, if you ever want to reach out to Vanessa for any additional questions or thoughts, I'll also have her contact information too. So I thank everybody again and hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you
Take
again.
care. Bye.
Bye-bye.